I am going to talk about some complicated equilibrium concepts, but importantly, I'm also going to spend a bunch of time here trying to convince you. Well, I don't know. What I mostly want you to do is understand all the cool questions you can answer with dynamics, right? So you saw some of this over the last couple days in the conference, but one thing I was realizing is that like you're learning all of these methods and we're just throwing methods at you over and over and over, right? It's at least like a fire hose of water coming at your face, which is fine, it's good. But to some extent, that's the easy part. I'm sorry to break it to you. The really hard part is to do the economics, okay? So the economics on this is how do you ask an interesting question, right? And how do you get the dynamic model that you write down and you estimate to actually help you answer that question? And so I'm gonna sort of, in the context of environmental economics, which is of course my specialty, I'm going to give you some questions that people have asked using dynamic methods and try to convince you that we should care about the answers. And we should, be thinking about not the most complicated equilibrium concept that you could possibly use in order to answer the question, but the simplest one. And only pull in these complicated equilibrium things when you really need them. Okay? So that's the basic idea. We'll see if I achieve even a third of that, but I figure I need to get it out there. Okay, so first of all, why should you study environmental economics? Let me just say one quick additional thing, because I feel like I need to be a little bit of a missionary out in the wild for environmental economics here. Scientists describe climate change as potentially an ice age in reverse over the next 100 years. Okay, it's very likely that the world as we know it is going to change. There's going to be more severe storms and things like this. And fundamentally, what's happening now and what's been happening and what will continue to happen is all sorts of policies are getting created to think about how to deal with that. That's a good thing, probably, actually getting policy response is good. But the problem here is my feeling, and people can argue with me if you want, is that economists are a little behind the 8 ball on this. We don't have enough answers for the policymakers when they come to us and they say, what should we do? Sometimes we say, well, carbon tax, and that's not politically feasible or whatever, and then they just go do whatever they want without our input. And that's bad, right? I'm egotistical enough about our field to think that that's bad, that we should be able to say some things to them about how to design better policies, even if they're not the best policy, okay? So I think that fundamentally, there's huge heterogeneity around the world over time in different contexts for different pollutants, for different environmental problems that lead to really interesting contexts for really interesting questions. And there's tons of room here. So part of what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through some of the empirical work in dynamics. There's obviously a much broader empirical work. Then I'm going to tell you about why I think some of these equilibrium concepts are really important in environmental. And at the end, I'm going to just throw out research ideas, right? Because basically my feeling on this is it's a race. We need answers. We need answers quickly. I can't write all the papers, so you all can help me write papers, okay? All right, that's the goal. So I think that a lot of energy and environmental economics, what I'll call EEE, is about dynamics. Why? Because policies that happen today fundamentally have super long run implications, potentially. I told you, ice age in reverse over the next 100 years. None of us are going to be around in 100 years, unless something crazy changes on health, but I don't study that. But fundamentally, there's a lot of fixed investments, and we have to decide when to undertake them. And then they pay off beyond that, right? And so research and design, efficiency upgrades, abatement technology adoption, legacy technology exit, all of these kinds of things, how do we get transitions to new technologies, to new setups? It's all about dynamics, and dynamics end up being incredibly important, and there aren't enough people merging the dynamics with the questions. Fundamentally, uncertainty, as you can tell, I'm quite interested in uncertainty. Uncertainty plays a huge role here. We're uncertain about what the impacts of any policy would be on climate, for instance, right? Huge uncertainty over that. You might care about avoiding the particularly bad downside risk, but you may also just not know what the potential impacts are. And then political uncertainty on top of all of this makes a lot of legislative strategy dynamic. In the United States, we have these elections every 4 years to change the executive branch, and that changes who's in charge of the agencies that make the policy. It can feel like whiplash, right? Things just change all over the place. We need to understand how to think about effectively, when should you stop negotiating over policy and pass it? Things like that. Okay, so I sort of already told you what I want to do. So let's just dive into it. So here's how I'm going to think about the layout of the lecture. I'm going to start with single agent models. Partially, I'm starting there because I want you to see that there are really interesting questions that you can answer with a relatively simple single agent model. There was a discussion yesterday about whether bus engine replacement is simple, relatively simple over the course of this week. In particular, I want to talk about oil drilling under uncertainty, residential solar adoption, and dynamic enforcement. Just 3 examples of single agent context where I think we answer some interesting questions. Then I'll go on to oligopoly models, in particular regulation, market power, and leakage, so the interactions between those things, and the policy uncertainty paper I talked about yesterday. Just a brief overview to get us into these ideas of when do you need to think about equilibrium, and I'm going to talk through the approximate equilibrium methods that Ariel didn't talk through, so we can sort of cover a bunch of sets. And then, as I said, at the end, I'll give you a bunch of research ideas. Okay, so dynamics without oligopoly can be really useful. And just as a relatively simple, well, the paper is not all that simple, but as a context where we think, this told us a lot, taught us a lot, is Ryan Kellogg's 2014 paper, The Effect of Uncertainty on Investment, Evidence from Texas Oil Drilling. So the real question here is, if you look at a time series of oil prices, they just move all over the place. They're jumping up and down, they're moving all crazily. All sorts of things change in the market. OPEC makes decisions, demand expectations change, all sorts of stuff happens. And sometimes they move like this, and sometimes they move like this, right? So sometimes there's more heterogeneity in where gas prices might be. And Ryan's basically asking in this question, sort of, how does that uncertainty affect your decision to drill an oil well? Okay, so just crash course in oil engineering, which, I am not an oil engineer, so this will hit the limits of my knowledge probably. But basically, when you drill an oil well, you put this well down deep, goes down and down and down, not much is going to happen until you get low enough and you punch through effectively a really thick layer of rock and you get to some amount of oil. And once that happens, that oil is under pressure, right? That's how it's created. It's being pushed down by all this weight of the earth, and it comes up, right? It's like popping a can of soda after you shook it. And just like shaking a can of soda and then opening it, it comes up really fast at first and then sort of slows down, right? And you don't actually have that much control over that oil extraction path once you drill the well. So this is an interesting context where the decision to just drill the well is a really important sort of, that is the thing, and then the oil that comes out of the well has some reasonable depreciation over time, and eventually it'll be so low that it's not even worth dealing with the well anymore, and you cap it and move on. So we make these decisions to start a specific place, to drill a specific well and start the flow of oil into the future. Once you do that, you're giving up what's effectively an option to drill that well later, right? So the second I sort of decide, okay, I'm going to pop through that underground rock and get to the oil, I'm giving up the option to drill in the future. Hopefully, I'm going to receive a stream of quantity of oil, right? Hopefully, I actually get to some oil down there, a reasonable quantity. There's some uncertainty about that. And if I do, then I'm going to sell it as it comes out of the well into the future. And I'm going to receive payments for that oil based on the world oil price. Yeah, because any individual well is very, very small relative to the world. Make sense? Basic idea. Okay, so it's clearly dynamic, right? It's a clear dynamic problem. And Ryan can basically sort of abstract from common ownership and things like that and say, all right, I'm just going to think about the single choice to drill the single well. What he's trying to figure out here is like, does uncertainty over future oil prices affect that decision to drill in the ways that we would expect from theory? So, you know, there's classic papers that think about how uncertainty should affect things, but actually showing that it happens in the data in the real world can be very difficult. And so what Ryan's going to find here, you know, and to be clear, I'm going to go very high level over the methods in these papers because they follow a lot of what people here have done. This is going to look a lot like bus engine replacement with a couple extra equations to deal with expectations of uncertainty. So what Ryan ends up finding is that higher expected oil price variation does decrease drilling, as sort of theory would suggest. And interestingly, the empirical magnitude is actually quite close to what theory would predict. I say surprisingly, I mean, I guess that proves that I'm not really a theorist when I say, you know, hey, it actually works. Amazing. And so we get this sort of these trade-offs between earning profits from having oil come out of the well and being unsure about whether those profits will continue given the variation in prices. The trade-off seems about right given discount rates and all of that. Importantly, Ryan can also show here that the economic cost of not responding to these shocks and uncertainty is substantial. So if you screw this up, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. Well, okay, maybe that's part of why the theory works, right? This is a high stakes setting. There's a lot of money potentially to be made on each of these wells. And the other interesting thing from the standpoint of empirical work is that forward-looking measures of uncertainty work much better than backward-looking ones. Okay, so if we think about like finance, people have taken finance classes, we're often thinking about, you know, what is uncertainty over stock prices today? What do? Well, we kind of look at what uncertainty has been recently. We look at what variation in stock prices have been recently. Increasingly now, we start to look at things like options, right? The whole distribution of options tells us something about what people might think uncertainty is going forward. But it's very, very hard sitting today to know what uncertainty is going to be going forward. And it's partially interesting that the firms are actually responding to something that ends up happening, right? That suggests that there actually is good information. Better information than just taking the variation in prices over the last 6 months and saying that's the uncertainty today. That's pretty interesting. It's particularly interesting in a situation where you're thinking about potentially policy being able to change some of the uncertainty over oil prices, right? So for instance, if you're thinking about OPEC having more or less global power over oil prices, in that kind of world where OPEC is trying to keep prices in a narrower band or something like that, this paper is telling us that that can substantially affect how much oil gets pulled out of the ground. And that's something we care about because once you burn the oil, you get carbon. Okay, in this particular setting, Ryan, because he's doing this single agent setup, single well setup, the counterfactuals that he's able to do are somewhat limited. And we're going to come back to this over and over again, because the real question from my standpoint, why do I do dynamic structural work? It's because I want to know counterfactuals. I want to know how the world might look under a different regime. And so fundamentally, he's going to be able to say, well, what if you screwed up the timing? What if you reacted differently? He's not able to say, what if all uncertainty changed? Because that's an equilibrium concept that he's not set up in this model to address. And so I'll come back to this over and over, but this is an important thing about judgment, which is a pain because it's hard to learn, right? But judgment in research is really important here. Ryan needed to sit down when he wrote this paper and think about what are the counterfactuals I want to do, right? If he wanted to do sort of these big general equilibrium counterfactuals, he would have had to set up his model differently. He would have had to make additional assumptions and things like that. And he decided that this was enough, right? That this was enough to answer his question. And this is a trade-off that you're going to see again and again and again when you actually go to try to apply these methods. I argue very strongly when I sit down with a new paper with my co-authors, we sit down and we talk about what are the types of counterfactuals we want here. Because if you think about that upfront when you're first writing down your model, it's incredibly helpful for figuring out which assumptions you do and don't want to make upfront. Okay. All right. So that's uncertainty in oil drilling. In solar adoption, it's another nice optimal stopping problem, right? So that was an optimal stopping problem. I've got this well, I've got to decide when to drill it. In residential solar adoption, we see a handful of papers, I'll go through two of them, that think about optimal stopping. And in particular, why is this interesting? Technology is advancing incredibly quickly in renewables. Solar prices are falling off a cliff. They're down 90% in the last 10 years, even more than that over 20 years. All of these new technologies are just getting so much better that to some extent you might say, well, I should wait. Why would I install solar right now? If it fell 90% over the last 10 years, what's it going to do going forward? Why would I spend tens of thousands of dollars potentially putting solar panels on my roof? At the same time, of course, we want people to adopt solar because it'll reduce the emissions from our electricity. So there's this trade-off that we really face. Modeling those trade-offs are really important for helping us understand policy. In particular, De Groot and Verboven in AER in 2019 are thinking very hard about discount rates. So I'll talk about that in more detail. But why are discount rates important? If individual household discount rates are different from the government's discount rate, the government can borrow money cheaply, but households are impatient, then the policy could just be to take earnings that the household would get in the future from not having to pay electricity bills and having solar instead, and bring them forward in time, right? You can do some intertemporal trade-offs of effectively saying, I'll give you an upfront investment subsidy rather than some long-run generation subsidy, okay? In my paper with Derek Lemoyne that just came out in Jerry, we look at the efficient shape of the time-varying subsidy schedule. So thinking just about upfront subsidies, we're saying, okay, a lot of these subsidy schedules start high and then decrease over time, often in a stepwise pattern. This started in Japan, actually, and basically like everybody, Germany, California, all these places, they have sort of adopted this idea that solar subsidies should decrease over time. And we're just going to ask, like, why? What are the efficiency implications of that? And the real reason why we started asking why is, you see like Gisele Bündchen and Tom Brady or Leonardo DiCaprio, they have these big solar systems on top of their fancy houses. And they got huge subsidies for these because they adopted them early. And so the question is like, did we need to pay them that money in order for them to adopt? I mean, they probably would have done it anyway, right? So should we be thinking about like over subsidizing people with really high values of solar relative to subsidizing later when prices have fallen and we can get more normal people to put solar on their roofs, even if they don't have super high willingness to pay? Okay. So these are both very dynamic questions, but they're dynamic questions that we're going to think about somewhat in this very single agent, not somewhat, completely in this single agent way. All right. So governments subsidize solar panels, they subsidize all sorts of stuff. And the argument for that is just that there's an externality from burning coal to generate electricity, right? So I'm going to step back. I'm not going to talk more about the efficiency of this or what the right subsidy should be. But let's just say governments want to do this. So how should they do it? They can choose between that upfront subsidy or this generation subsidy. They can basically say for every megawatt hour, kilowatt hour of electricity that you produce, we're going to give you some money. They can give you that money by basically saying you're producing electricity and selling it into the grid at a higher price. They can give you that money by saying you don't have to pay for the electricity that you're using off the grid, things like that. There's levels of each of those two subsidies that make you completely indifferent, right? I can basically give you more money up front, or I can pay you a higher per unit rate. So to some extent, we should just not really care if we were thinking about two policies that were of the same level. The issue, though, as I suggested, is that if the government is perhaps more patient than households, that changes the equation completely, right? There's a question of whether we should think that government is or isn't more patient than households, and you'll see, well, I'll say in my paper with Derek, we just assume that the discount rates are the same. But fundamentally, it's an empirical question, right? Something you can learn from the data. And so explicitly, De Groot and Verboven are going to think about this problem. How are they going to do it? So it's an optimal stopping problem. What affects your optimal stopping problem? and actually this is for both papers, this much is the same. Well, I'm going to install solar when the upfront cost of solar, given my expectations of the future evolution of that cost, is enough to offset electricity prices now and into the future, right? So I have to think about the current prices, the future prices of both electricity and solar, and then potentially government policies. If I think the government policy is going to change in the future, that's going to change my behavior. And importantly, I told you there were these step patterns of how subsidies step down. And you see in the data over and over again, these big spikes in adoption right before the decline in the subsidy. Makes sense, of course, right? If I can take advantage of a higher upfront subsidy today that I won't be able to do tomorrow, that's going to discourage me from maintaining the option value of not having installed yet, right? And so I'm going to have the incentive to sort of hop to it. That's actually part of the incentive for a decreasing subsidy, right? A decreasing subsidy over time will pull consumers forward to take advantage of that high upfront subsidy. Okay, so both papers are going to sort of assume more or less full information, at least rational expectations in some cases and full information in others. The Gruen and Boven have a nice trick. And this is a nice trick that I come back to time and again when I think about how should you identify beta? How should I identify the discount rate? So they're looking at Flanders, and in Flanders, they had these policies to subsidize the generation of electricity from solar, right? So it's not an upfront subsidy. It's telling you that we will buy solar from you at some high price, basically. And these policies changed over time. At first, they went for 20 years, and then they stepped back and said, no, we'll only give it to you for 10 years. This is perfect, right? Nothing changes about today's choice except for a payoff that happens in the future. You see that? That's exactly the kinds of stories that like Aaron and others were talking about the other day. How do we intuitively identify beta? We change something out there that doesn't change anything else here. Okay. In our paper, in Derek and my paper, we're matching, Derek's more of an applied theorist, and so he does a whole bunch of theory, and then I go estimate this dynamic model. But we're really thinking about the fact that high initial subsidies are great because they pull adoption forward in time, which is something we may want in order to reduce emissions and offset externalities and all of that. It's also nice to get people to stop waiting for lower future. This incentive to pull things forward are going to be even more extreme when we expect big declines in solar prices. The other nice thing about that is not just that we might want more pollution offset today, but it's that we think that there's things like learning and peer effects that might accumulate over time, right? So we might think that the more solar panels that a farm produces, the cheaper they're able to do it. Or alternatively, if I'm driving down the street and I see solar panels on my neighbor's roofs, I think, oh yeah, maybe that's something I should do. Or I go ask them and say, hey, do you like those? What's your bill? How much do you pay for electricity now? All those things. I learn something about the fact that this is a good idea and my actual willingness to pay somehow goes up. To be clear, both of these things have been there's been a lot of theory thinking about how important they could be. There's been some really bad empirical work thinking about how big they possibly are. And there's been a little bit of good theory, empirical work, but I think there's a lot more room to tell us about whether these things are real and how big they are, okay? A lot of what I'll call lefty politics surrounding the environment thinks these things are big. As I said yesterday, I was raised by reduced form labor economists, and so my willingness to believe peer effect estimates is very, very low. But if you came up with a really good situation in which you could identify this, where you could basically somehow shock, say, Fedor's likelihood of adopting solar panels and then see how I react, that'd be pretty cool. Okay. All right. In this paper, we're literally just going to sort of calibrate, like, how big would those have to be to do something crazy? Okay. We're not going to estimate them here. The argument for higher later subsidies, of course, is the Leonardo DiCaprio sort of argument, like, why should we give him money? Because he would have put them on his roof anyway. And also the fact that as those prices decline, there's more bang for your buck in terms of subsidy, right? Now the costs are lower, so $1 per installed watt increases, decreases the price by a lot more, a much higher percentage. So fundamentally, and that would, if we believed in peer effects, if we think that peer effects are substantial, then that's another reason to delay subsidizing. All right, so what do we find in these two papers? Literally, I didn't go into the details of estimation at all because it's just basically nested fixed point. In one case in CCP, in the other, it's just what you've learned already. So DeGroot and Verboven find that households have a high discount rate in the teens. I guess there's a question of whether you think that's particularly high, but we don't need to get super deep into that. They're going to argue that that households in Flanders can get loans at about 5% or something, and that's their argument for why this is particularly high. But fundamentally, if you do believe that these are higher than the cost of borrowing for the government, then this does give you a very clear story that you should choose for the exact same level of policy to do the upfront policy instead of the policy that subsidizes production over time. In our paper, we actually find that in California, the efficient subsidy is increasing. Okay. We can't find a single solar policy around the world that increases, that's announced as increasing. The advantage of this increasing adoption is that, we're going to really take advantage of those declines in solar prices that we're expecting, right? And that's huge because the bang for your buck that you get, if you basically have a fixed budget and you want to get as much solar as you can, or you have a fixed amount of solar you want and want to minimize your costs, either way, it's really advantageous for you to take advantage of those lower prices in the future, you being the government in that context. It's true for a super wide range of assumptions. We, throw all sorts of stuff at it. It's very, very hard for us to break. You basically have to have the government value current adoption at an order of magnitude above where we think the actual value is in order to get a decreasing subsidy. It really suggests that there's a lot of money being wasted on these subsidies. I mean, okay, maybe I should have started from that assumption as an economist that there would be money wasted, but this is a particular way in which money is being left on the table, right? Or in particular, that per dollar of government spending, there's not enough solar being installed, right? And that's bad, right? Why? Well, because you could use that dollar of government subsidy for tons of other things, right? Even if you don't care about the environment at all, you could feed the poor or lower taxes or whatever you want to do with it, right? So these are really potentially important quantities that we're talking about, quantities of money. All right, questions? Okay, and let me be clear, I'm not going to do much here with like tons of equations. So I'm giving very high level on this because I think you've seen a lot of the methods that go into these.
So how do you define, you're just saying here subsidies, you have this increasing part, it's going to increase the level of adoption, right? There's no normative statement about how much adoption there should be.
Yeah, so we do, in an appendix, we do sort of what the efficient level is. But the way we're setting it up is literally just to say the government decided they wanted X megawatts of installed. How do they do it cheapest? Or they decided they're willing to spend Y $1 million. How do they get the most they can? That level, our feeling on this was that choice of what X and Y are is like super political and actually fairly divorced from like economic efficiency. But in an appendix, we sort of show, okay, what should we think about what the right level would be? But it all has to end up being calibrated because we care about things like the social cost of carbon.
So you're saying there is a justification, economic justification for subsidies.
As long as your non-solar electricity is being generated with fossil fuels, yes. Yes. Because, yeah. If you happen to have geothermal as the rest, if you're in Iceland, then no, not so much.
So even if there's a price on the fossil fuel,
no, but in most of the world there isn't, or not an efficient one.
So just one more thing, is it better to subsidize or put a price? Yeah, I mean, is that a question?
Oh, almost definitely better to put a price, right? But, well, I'm from the US. Tax is a 4-letter word. Yeah, my sense is that environmental and energy folks that I talk to a lot have basically decided that all of us screaming carbon tax, carbon tax, carbon tax at the top of our lungs, the time for that has passed. Nobody listened. And now it's time to figure out what else we can give input on. That doesn't mean I don't think carbon taxes are a good idea, but they seem politically infeasible in many places. And so we need to figure out what second or third best looks like and how not to waste a ton of money on it. Yeah. Was there a hand? Yeah.
Option, for example, if earnings tax only depends on the level of earnings, while the solar tax does not depend on how much you spend on. Like a progressive tax system depending on the level of how much it costs. Why does it depend on the time?
Well, so if you were able to adopt enough solar all at once, then it might depend on the quantity, but not generally for the quantities we're talking about for households, right? So to the extent that you could basically get rid of all coal on the grid and move to getting rid of some natural gas, then the subsidy should change, right? Because coal has more emissions than natural gas. And so now you've gotten rid of coal, which was sort of high carbon tax world, and you're moving to a slightly lower marginal cost of emissions. That's generally not the magnitude of these policies. I mean, I think in our paper, we end up seeing over the course of the California Solar Initiative, 0.7% of households adopted solar. It's a big number actually, but it's not that much in terms of total megawatts of solar that are installed. Why does it vary over time? Well, it varies over time because technology is changing, is the biggest thing, right? And once you adopt these, once you install solar panels, you got them for 20 years, basically, you should think. And so we treat that as basically you're done, it's full stopping. We're not going to think about the choice to replace 20 years from now because we don't see that in the data yet. But fundamentally, the fact that technology is changing over time, which means that costs are changing over time. And if you wanted to, you could also think about the fact that emissions from the alternative generation are changing over time. That leads to the idea that, yeah, we should be thinking about how these change over time. Yep, good. Anything else? Okay. All right, so another another single agent setting that we think is, that I think is important, because I wrote the paper. For a lot of environmental policies, we see really low fines for non-compliance and yet super high compliance. Okay, so this is true sort of around the world. The example that I'm going to think about is the Clean Air Act amendments in the United States. The Clean Air Act amendments have all sorts of things in them, but basically, you know, they're saying that these manufacturing facilities and other emitters of air pollution should meet certain technology standards. If your technology breaks down and you don't fix it, you're out of compliance and you need to invest in fixing the technology. It's the way to think about it. And basically, it's super, super rare that your technology breaks and you don't fix it. Which is kind of crazy because the fines are like $1,000, which, you know, we're talking about oil refineries. The sheer magnitude of revenues on these things relative to $1,000, no real reason to think in a static sense. Well, maybe the static interpretation of that is that the cost of fixing it is less than $1,000, right? Because you don't want to accrue that $1,000 fine over time. In a dynamic sense, though, well, we're pretty confident that these things cost a lot more than $1,000 to fix. And so then we're left with a puzzle that dynamics help us solve. Okay, and so what we're saying in this paper, and we're building on this literature, theoretical literature that came before, is that there's a threat of high future fines that gets you to invest even when your cost of investment is way above the fine. So let's, I mean, a simple example. Anybody getting up at 2 a.m. tomorrow? No? All right, yellow cards and red cards. Yeah, okay, there we got one hand. Good. Yellow cards and red cards in soccer, right? So you get a yellow card. What does that do? Really not much, right? You get a kick. They get a kick. What it does, though, is it puts you on notice. You are now in an elevated state. You are potentially a bad actor. If you get a second, it's not much of a penalty, But if you get a second yellow card, you're thrown out of the game, your team plays a man down the rest of the time. This is a really terrible outcome, right? And it's that threat of the red card. We see this, you see them talk about it, sports announcers talk about it when you watch football, that, that players behave differently when on a yellow card, right? When they have one yellow card. And this is exactly what we're going to do here in environmental enforcement. We're basically going to say, look, and you see this in the US, you see firms that are in compliance, that are violators, and that are high priority violators, okay? And what that basically does is it sets up this world where violators get slaps on the wrist, just like a single yellow card. But high priority violators can really bring the hammer down. And that means that those violators who are sitting in this state where they're more likely to get moved up into the high priority violator status have a huge incentive to clean up their act and get back to compliance. Okay? All right, so how does it work? What we really want to ask in this paper is like, what's the value of this? Okay, we want to, I mean, not just does it work? Okay, we can sort of play with that, but we really want to know, like, what are the trade-offs that are happening here that make this the right policy to potentially use? In what circumstances should we use this policy? So we write down like not a toy model, I guess. I don't get to use that term anymore, but my husband, who actually is a theorist, would call it problem set theory, which is, I think, even more derogatory. But we write down a two-period model, so a really simple theory model. And we show that dynamic enforcement mechanisms have value, in particular when regulators dislike imposing penalties. So this is key. There's no real necessarily reason why we should think that the EPA doesn't like imposing fines. And in fact, talking to some tax attorneys in the US, they actually think this isn't the right model for tax enforcement because they think the IRS does like imposing fines. But the EPA, particularly the political economy of it, does suggest that they are not in the business of shutting firms down. That is not good for their long run viability as an agency. And so they don't like imposing penalties. They don't like pollution, of course. And so they have to make some trade-offs here. And in particular, when plants have heterogeneous compliance costs. So I don't know exactly what fine will particularly get Ariel to comply with my regulation. And I need to sort of recover it. One thing I can do is give him a little teeny fine, but threaten a big one. As long as he's somewhere in between, I'm good. And I mean, and in our simple theory model, I never need to impose that big fine, in fact. Okay. So we want to understand the empirical trade-offs, and in particular, three big questions. How much higher would pollution be if fines were not state dependent, right? So if I couldn't bring down a big hammer when you're in high priority violator status, but the overall fine level was the same. So what if just everybody who was in violation got the same fine? It didn't matter what your history was. Alternatively, how much higher would fines need to be to achieve the same level of pollution in that world? And then finally, how different would outcomes be under Pigouvian taxes? So here is a world where you're basically going to try to say, all right, what's the efficient outcome and how is this different from it, potentially? All right. Yeah.
Can you explain again what is the non-state fine?
Yeah, so the state here is compliance, violator, high priority violator. There's more to the state, but for the sake of argument, that's the one that matters. And so all I'm doing here, and I should have put the picture, and there's a picture in the paper that shows that the average fine when you're in compliance is like measurement error. It's probably literally measurement error on our part. When you're in regular violator, that's the like $1,000. And the average fine per quarter when you're a high priority violator is something like $100,000. That now that's a little bit skewed upwards by like Volkswagen diesel emission standard issues and things like that, but you should think of them as big. And so what if I could still impose the same total level of fines in the economy, but I couldn't make it small for violators and big for priority violators? Okay. So the basic overview of the model is that we model, so this is a game, actually, right? It's a game between individual firms and the regulator. The regulator, the way we make this work is we think of the regulator as actually having to follow policy. So they basically have to decide ahead of time, what am I going to do in every state of the game? And they announce it, and it's public knowledge, and firms play against that sort of fixed regime. Okay, so that's the way that we make this simpler. We're not thinking about optimal best responses to individual firms. We're not trying to recover the regulator's utility function that underlies this, although I think that's super interesting, and I'm working a little bit on that in a follow-up paper. But in this setting, plants are going to have heterogeneous costs of investment and regulatory outcomes. So I don't like spending money, but I also don't like getting fines. I don't like being in high priority violator status. Perhaps, you know, it does go in the news, for instance, and the local population could get ticked at me. In this model, violations arrive exogenously and probabilistically move plants into higher regulatory states. Stuff breaks, right? And you don't call the plumber until the pipe bursts. So there's no investment in compliance. In compliance, nothing's broken. But once something breaks, you have a choice of whether to invest and fix it or not. If I invest, there's a chance it'll fix it and there's a chance it won't. If I get one violation, it could be a bad violation. I could go straight to priority violator status. That generally doesn't happen. Generally, I accumulate some violations and the EPA gets ticked and says, no, you're going to priority violator now. So the regulators announcing this enforcement policy ahead of time, it dislikes, as I suggested, this weighted average of pollution, fines, and particularly inspections are the thing that it has control over. But we don't know the weights. And so what we do is just use CCPs here, right? So we're literally just going to say, okay, we see a whole bunch of firms in a whole bunch of different states. Let's estimate what the probability is that the regulator takes each action. Let's estimate what the expected fine is in each of these states. We fit a functional form to that of sort, but it's fairly flexible. So this looks a whole lot like the CCP stuff that we've seen, but it's just going to describe this fixed regulatory environment, and then the firms play against it as single agents, and our lives are so much easier in terms of computation. Okay. All right. So given their expectations of regulator actions, plants are going to make optimal investment decisions, given their Bellmans. And we here use a quasi-maximum likelihood estimator with a nested fixed point. We assume plants are in a long-run steady state. Okay. I guess this looks to some extent like bus engine replacement or something like that, with a bunch of complications, of course. We're actually going to do something here that I don't know has come up. We're going to follow Naveau, Turner, and Williams, which is an econometrica paper from 2016. And we're going to estimate actually effectively random coefficients. So let me give you a little bit of an intro to how we do this. What we basically do is we say, okay, we're going to guess, there's 5 coefficients we're estimating in this model. It's the 5 costs of investment, fines, violations, et cetera. And we're going to come up with 10,001 potential vectors of these coefficients. They're sort of spread over the space, right? And at each one of those 10,001 coefficient vectors, we're going to calculate a whole bunch of moments. Moments are going to be things like investment probability, serial correlation and investment probability, stuff like that. Then we're going to have those actual moments from the data, and we're actually just going to run an OLS regression. Okay, it's a constrained OLS. What we do is we run the regression of the data on these 10,001 moments, and we're estimating the weight, the coefficient on each one of those that best explains the data. But I'm calling them weights because they're going to sum to 1. They're going to be between 0 and 1 and sum to 1. And so this is effectively saying, like, each of us could be different, but we're from some number of types, potentially at 10,001 types, but we're going to estimate what share of each of us are in each of these categories. So computationally, the difficult thing here is calculating your model 10,001 times for each of these moments. But after you have that, it's effectively a data set, and it runs in MATLAB in a few minutes. And MATLAB actually has really easy built-in controls, built-in commands to estimate a constrained OLS. Okay. So this is nice because this gives us that, like, I could be the type of plant that has really high investment costs and really needs the big stick threatening. Whereas Andrew could be someone who has a low investment cost and with a slap on the wrist actually does it fine no matter what, right? And we can pull that out of the data. Okay, so what do we find? Eliminating dynamic enforcement, so this is moving to this non-state contingent fines in particular and inspections, raises pollution damages 164%, holding fines constant, or raises fines 519%, holding pollution damages constant. Literally, if you aren't allowed to base the fine on the history of the firm, of the plant, then the fines are going to have to go up by 5 times in order to keep pollution the same. That's super valuable, right? I mean, it's only super valuable if you care how high the fines are. If you just think that's a transfer, you might not care. But fundamentally, we can have much, much lower fines with the same amount of pollution damages with this dynamic enforcement structure. Doubling fines for high priority violators decreases pollution damages 3% and increases fines 13%. Okay, what does that mean? To my eye, that means that actually increasing the slope of this enforcement schedule, making it, making an even bigger stick when you're in the bad state isn't worth that much. I generally tell a joke here that I often don't find that government's doing things right. And I'm not saying they're doing it right exactly here, but this is good evidence that they shouldn't necessarily be doing more of this. What they're doing is valuable, but there's not necessarily room for a lot more improvement by making it steeper. Peruvian fines are way higher than observed fines, coming back to this idea that in the United States, we're not so good at efficiency of pollution regulation, but fine. We end up taking the Peruvian fine escalation shape and scaling it down to get to sort of the actual damages that we see from pollution. Fines still increase by almost 400%. So if you're an enforcement agency that cares about both fines and pollution, this stuff is super valuable. So let's come back to soccer for a second. This is an interesting thing that I think is right in soccer, which is that the referee doesn't want to impose fines, right? Referee doesn't want to have free kicks, doesn't want to have dirty play, and doesn't want to be involved in the game. That's costly. That's bad for you as a referee. Also, of course, doesn't want the bad behavior and doesn't want to have to get involved. And so this threat of the red card, of putting people on notice with the yellow card, but carrying the big stick, means that the referee doesn't have to engage as much in the game. Interesting side effect. So this paper, we feel like this is so I should say one other thing on this paper. On our websites, we have 3 problem sets on this paper that walk you through the full estimation. Okay, so the first problem set's completely reduced form, just shows the motivation for why dynamic enforcement might be valuable and why you need to estimate a dynamic model. Second one is just maximum likelihood with homogeneous coefficients. And the third one takes you through the whole heterogeneous coefficients model. Okay. Okay. Questions on that? All right. I gotta think about my timing here. All right, so moving on to dynamic oligopoly. I'm diving right into this. Before I dive into this, let me just say, so all those 4 papers that I already talked about, they were single agent. And single agent is nice because you don't have to worry about all this stupid equilibrium stuff, right? That's hard. We don't like doing that. And everybody here can fight about whether you've got the right assumptions over your equilibrium and Markov or not Markov. We don't like that. But it does limit the counterfactuals, right? Just like I said on Ryan Kellogg's paper, we can't, for instance, in this last paper, we can't do crazy. We can't think about how this affects the product market or competition or things like that, right? We're not thinking about interactions between firms here at all, and we're not thinking about responses between the regulator and the firms. So fundamentally, we are somewhat limited in what we can do. All right. In Meredith Fowley, Marta Gwant, and Stephen Ryan's 2016 paper, AER, I believe, they really want to think about the fact that environmental policy can affect the product market, right? And so explicitly, it can affect the product market in a couple of ways. One thing is it can lead to market power changes, right? It can lead firms to different things. For instance, you could have a firm exit because it's a high emissions rate firm, and that could concentrate the industry enough to create market power concerns. And additionally, a long-running issue in environmental economics is whether if one country regulates emissions, why doesn't all the manufacturing just leave and go elsewhere and then ship their goods in, right? That's called leakage. And so fundamentally, they really want to understand this, and they're going to focus on this in the cement industry. The overview of the model, basically firms are going to choose entry and capacity in these local markets. I mean, I guess I'm IO, some of you are more labor, but we love cement in IO. I was teaching MBAs, and Cemex is a Mexican cement company, and there's a pretty good case on it. I'm talking all about cement. Like, did you work in this industry? I said, no, I'm just an IO economist. We love cement. Why do we love cement? It's super cheap. Like, it's just the bag of cement is cheap. It's really heavy. It's hard to ship a long way, right? So it makes our markets nice and small. I love that. Okay, and it has huge environmental externalities. Okay, so not only does it take a ton of electricity to heat up the kilns to create cement, but actually the chemical process itself of creating cement releases emissions. So cement is sort of, in environmental economists' eyes, it's sort of the last industry. It's going to be the hardest industry to decarbonize in many ways. One of the hardest. There's probably smaller ones. It's a big one too, right? So we think a lot about cement. All right, so what are they going to do here? There's this homogeneous goods market. It's relatively small. The state's going to include current capacity and your emissions rate. There's different technologies, so different firms emit different amounts of carbon. And then they're just going to estimate demand and import supply curves and marginal costs in the initial step, right? And so the real game here is going to be how, and in particular in counterfactuals, changing the cost of emissions changes the investment decisions, right? So now if I'm a relatively dirty plant, I may want to invest in the new clean technology that puts me in a different competitive position with my rivals and with foreign imports or into the market. Okay, so in particular, they're going to think about carbon cap and trade / tax. Okay, since I'm convincing you all to become environmental economists, I'm just going to quickly say cap and trade is a tax when operating appropriately. Okay, good. I'm getting the yeah, no shit. This sometimes comes up. We can model them interchangeably. They're also, though, going to do a slightly different one, which is cap and trade, where incumbents get free permits. And so fundamentally, you can auction off the permits, which looks a whole heck of a lot like a tax, or you can just give some to buy off political opposition, basically. And they're going to do that. And they're also going to do a border adjustment tax, so taxing the imports. Okay, so the authors here are going to use CCP estimation following BBL and Stephen Ryan's job market paper. The basic setup here is, they have these CCPs, and they're going to say, all right, we know the policies that the firms chose. And so we're going to choose a whole bunch of alternative policies, and those must have been worse, right? It's the basic setup of BBL. The value functions they're going to end up getting, they're only going to calculate the value functions at a set of points in the state, and then they're going to impose a functional form across them. This is a sort of interesting simplification. It means that they can basically estimate just a small number of coefficients per firm, which is really useful when you've got this continuous state of investment, especially when you have a bunch of firms making different investment choices that you have to play against. The counterfactuals that vary the environmental policies are going to be limited to only those markets with 5 or fewer firms. That's just for computational feasibility reasons. And they're always going to assume that the implied tax is the social cost of carbon. So this is sort of interesting, right? They're having these firms compete in the cement market, subject to the regulatory constraints, but there's not actually competition in the permit market, right? There's no ability to exercise market power over there. There's no uncertainty over what that is going to happen in that market. So it's a substantial simplifying assumption, but it's there. Okay. My sense is that calculating the counterfactuals for this paper is very, very hard. And maybe required some simplifying assumptions, but it's not completely clear. Okay. So importantly, what do they find? So they find that policy can increase the exercise of market power. And particularly for like levels of social cost of carbon that they're putting into these markets that we observe, this leads, so there's market power and there's leakage. And that actually means that the efficient carbon tax, like at the social cost of carbon, lowers social welfare. This is not what I teach my undergrads in environmental economics, right? The whole point here is you want to internalize the externality. But when only part of the industry is covered and by the policy, and when firms are competing in not perfect competition, that result breaks down. It's not guaranteed. They do find that if the social cost of carbon is really, really high, if carbon is more damaging than they thought it was at the time, and I'll say we are revising our social cost of carbon upwards, so we're getting into ranges where this may be more reasonable. You do get welfare gains, and in particular, part of what you can do is you can design the policies to do better, where you're basically helping you're taxing carbon, but allowing output. So you're trying to encourage output conditional on the good technology. All right. Let's do, okay. So I said in this paper that counterfactuals are hard. And part of the reason that counterfactuals are hard is that the equilibrium in this paper is incredibly complex, okay? You've got investment decisions that are continuous across potentially more than 5, well, they limit it to 5 firms, they're making entry decisions and all of this. So what we really want to do, but this is a standard issue in environmental economics. You have some policy, and the policy is about emissions, or it's about pollution, or something like that. And it's put on firms. But firms aren't competing, like that's not their market. The product isn't emissions. The product is something else, right? In this context, cement. Or in other contexts, electricity, like the paper I presented yesterday, right? In all of these markets, and as IO economists, we care about those markets and we care about competition in those markets. So often we're thinking here about, okay, I want equilibrium because I need to know that this, this policy I'm putting in might have second order effects, or not even second order, but secondary effects. They could be even bigger, as Fowley, Rigaud, and Ryan find, that are really, really, really important. Okay, so this paper I think of as very difficult, but also suggesting that we really care about this stuff, that this can change what policy you should think about substantially. Okay, so what do we do about it? So the things that I've been thinking about a lot are these approximate equilibrium approaches, and they're an alternative to what Ariel talked about. So top is basically what I already said. You've got a product market, you've got pollution, it's a secondary thing, it's not what you're addressing. Historically, there are some policies that just limit output in the product market, right? But we don't like those as environmental economists, right? Why don't we like just saying you can't produce more than X electricity? I'm talking too much, nobody else is talking. Why should you not limit the quantity in the output market, but do something else instead? Uh-oh. Why should I not say you can only produce X tons of cement if I'm concerned about the emissions from cement production? Go for it. Guessing is better than not guessing. Okay, yeah, so it does sort of limit the potential for substitution, I think is part of what you're thinking about here, right? But part of that is, what if I could produce cement better, right? What if I could produce cement with less pollution? Then I don't need to not build houses, right? What you're effectively saying, if you're saying no more cement, is that you're not going to build these houses. You're not encouraging innovation. You're not encouraging efficiency. You're not encouraging good investments and making cement with less pollution. So we like regulating the bad, not the good. Cement is a good, right? So we regulate the bad, and so we need to think about how that regulation affects the good market. All right. As Victor explained the other day, the issue here is that the state space can explode really quickly, right? So we might be keeping track of 10 states per firm with 6 firms, and that would be an incredibly small state space, right? And you get to 1 million states. 10 things per firm is very small, and you quickly get to 1 million. So approximate equilibrium methods here can be really helpful, and they're particularly helpful for counterfactuals. Estimation, you can sometimes get away with not using them. I'll show you where. All right. So I'm going to go through 3 types of ways to address these problems. The first is oblivious equilibrium. In an oblivious equilibrium, you have a whole bunch of small firms that are playing against a steady state market distribution of firms. So there's something in this that looks a little bit like what Ario was talking about, just this idea that, you know, I have some sense of what I'm playing against. I can't really influence that. My decisions don't affect that. But in equilibrium, I will have correct expectations, basically. In moment-based Markov equilibrium, which comes from Ifrak and Weintraub, oblivious equilibrium is Bankard, a co-author who I'm not remembering at the moment, and Weintraub. Huh? Thank you. In moment-based Markov equilibrium, players are going to keep track. We're going to divide firms into dominant and fringe. Everybody's going to keep track of what the dominant players do, but we're all only going to keep track of that distribution of the fringe, right? So some distribution of investment levels or something like that that the fringe do, and then the dominant firms, we care explicitly who they are. Importantly, dominant firms are aware that they can affect the market state. So I'm aware that if I take this action, you're all going to see it and behave differently than if I don't. Okay, but fringe firms don't do that. In Gauer-Senker and Langer and Zhang, our extension, we're going to do things slightly differently. We don't want to divide firms into dominant and fringe. We don't think that's accurate in our setting. That's, again, where those judgment calls come in that are a little difficult. But players are going to keep track of aggregate market states that affect payoffs. So in our paper in particular, what affects payoffs is electricity prices, really. And so we need some things that we think affect electricity prices. And in particular, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that our market only has coal and combined cycle natural gas, and that all coal and all natural gas are the same. So then we can think about a supply curve, right? That's literally just like this, right? One here and one here. And at first, coal is down here and natural gas is up here in terms of the costs, right? There's just some efficiency of these plants, and I have to buy fuel and my costs end up here. But then the market changes, the world changes, natural gas gets cheap, fracking starts creating a lot of natural gas, potentially polluting the water and doing other bad things, but helping in this context, because it leads to a shift, right? Natural gas comes down below in the supply curve. And so really what we care about there is how much coal is there relative to natural gas, and where are they relative to each other cost-wise? And so those are 2 really, well, I don't know, I wrote the paper, so I guess I feel like those are the most important things, but I think I can argue to you that those are really the most important things that are going to affect my expectations of profits going forward. If I can do that, then it's nice, because now I can say every single player knows that if they do something different, they're changing everyone else's expectations of how those things are going to evolve. Okay. So if I adopt abatement technology, that's a signal to all my rivals that I'm likely to stay in, that more coal has adopted abatement technology. That means more coal is going to be hanging around in the future, so I may want to exit. My rivals may want to exit that context. Okay. I mostly think of this setup with these 3 as giving you a taste of what's possible. I guess one thing I'm trying to wrap my head around a bit, so I'm clearly not an econometrician per se. I do econometrics and I need to prove some things occasionally, but I think of these things very intuitively. And so I think of these different equilibrium concepts. There's all sorts of minor derivations or minor deviations off of these things that are probably more right in other contexts. And I think that's what we're doing here partially with our extension of MME, is we're saying MME didn't quite make sense in our context, in our market. We needed to do something slightly different, and I'll show you precisely what. And by doing that slightly different thing, it helps us better fit the underlying economics of our market. And that's what we should be after, right? That's what we're always trying to get at in these models. How can we best fit what's going on as simply as possible? Okay, so oblivious equilibrium, there I have been right there, although I think that's out of order. A version of oblivious equilibrium is used in the recent paper that won the Frisch medal, but also Buchholz does in his paper. Those are neither of those are precisely environmental papers, but it is being used. The basic idea is that many small players are going to make decisions given the distribution of their competitors, and all those decisions should lead to that distribution when they're all summed up. And the nice thing there is that each player only needs to keep track of her own state and this distribution of competitors. So we can think of that as like, what are the investment levels out there in the world across firms? Just think about that distribution probability of firms being in each investment level, and I play against that given my investment level. To solve this thing, you're going to calculate strategies and the distribution, that steady state distribution. So thinking it through really simply, conditional on some theta vector, where theta, of course, are all those structural parameters that we care about. You're going to specify some potential steady state distribution of industry outcomes, capacities, things like that. Then you're going to, given those, simulate what all your players should do in your data. That's going to generate a steady state distribution, right? It's going to generate the probabilities of falling in each capacity bin, for instance. Doing that is a little, simulating forward involves solving the Bellmans and recovering choice probabilities and all of that. But now, once you do that, you have a new distribution, and you can just say, like, okay, I've got vectors of probabilities of having each investment level. How close are they, right? And I keep doing this until they get very, very close. And once they're very, very close, like machine precision kind of close, I go to the next theta, right? And I have to do this like in a maximum likelihood sense. I'm going to do this over and over again to find the theta that maximizes the likelihood. For estimation, you may or may not actually need to do this because, of course, you know what the true distribution of firms out there is, right? You know what share of firms are in each of the capacity bins. And so you can basically just say, okay, that's the truth. I need to find the thetas that make that true, right, in my model. But for counterfactuals, you're going to have to do it over and over again, right? Or you're going to have to do it until you find the equilibrium. Okay. Pros and cons. It has some really appealing characteristics. The first is that, of course, in a very simple, very important, but simple sense, it aligns individual strategies with market outcomes, right? I expect what the industry will look like, I play against that, and that is what the industry looks like. That's sort of at the core of most of these equilibrium ideas, that sort of has to be true. But it also allows me, the researcher, to summarize actions of many small players, right? Which could be attractive in certain economic contexts. It has its drawbacks, and in its purest sense, it's not used for estimation in an industry that's not in sort of a long-run steady state. So there is a follow-up paper that's unpublished that was thinking about this thing evolving over time towards some steady state. But in its basic sense, you can't do things like have natural gas prices change, right? Because that would lead to some new distribution that you don't know. I think there's probably ways to relax that, but and so also, it just doesn't make a lot of sense in a context like electricity, where we see these big energy transitions underway, but it might make sense in other markets. I mean, potentially cement would be one market where this could make sense, or global shipping in the Brancaccio and all paper. Okay, the other problem as I see it is that because actors don't think they can affect the market state, and they do, but only kind of epsilon amount, that you lose a lot of really interesting questions, right? So you lose some dynamic strategy kinds of questions. But when am I going to?
Well, you have 120.
Okay, great. So those are real drawbacks, and we want to kind of get around that. So to get around that, we move to more moment-based Markov equilibrium. Okay, so this is Ifak and Weintraub, and as I said yesterday, there's 3 recent papers. Offshore oil drilling is Nick paper. Someday I'll have Nick tell me how to say his last name, but Todd Girardin's paper has this in counterfactuals, and Ji-hee Jun is using this in shipping. The basic idea in moment-based Markov equilibrium is you're going to divide players into dominant and fringe. As I said, everybody's going to keep track of all the dominant players, right? These are the guys we all need to follow. We all need to know what they're doing. But all we care about from the fringe players is like where the distribution of where they're landing. We don't care what any individual one of them does. Dominant players can affect the state, fringe players can't, or not intentionally, not actively. Both groups are aware of this, right? It's sort of important. And the equilibrium is just the expected state evolutions match optimal strategies given these expectations, right? Again, I expect something to happen, and that actually is what happens, ends up being the equilibrium. How do you do this? It looks really similar. I mean, we're going to specify distributions of potential dominant firms, dominant firm outcomes, and market state evolutions or fringe outcomes. We're going to simulate optimal decisions against that. Use those simulated decisions to specify new distributions, repeat until a change in distributions is small, pick a new theta, repeat it all again. Similarly to oblivious equilibrium, solving for equilibrium at each theta might not be required for estimation, but it's going to be required for counterfactuals almost definitely. And that's exactly what you see in some of these papers. I think maybe all 3 of these papers don't need to do it for estimation, and they only do it for counterfactuals. Okay. Pros and cons. Has some appealing characteristics. Keeps the state space relatively tractable, right? If I just have 2 or 3 fringe players, okay, maybe I have 10 cubed, but I'm not at 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 100, right? Thinking about Victor's example. It definitely allows for more interesting forms of competition. So the dominant players understand that they can take strategic actions. They can take actions that will affect how everybody responds to them. Nested fixed point estimation can be done with single agent dynamic solutions. It keeps it relatively easy. You don't have to do anything too complicated for estimation. It has drawbacks. So because the market power is assumed limited to the dominant players, these fringe players can't affect the aggregate state. And so it really matters who you choose are dominant versus fringe, right? I mean, that's in some industries, it might be fine. It might be very, very clear who's dominant and who's fringe, but not necessarily all the time. Okay. Let's do what we do in our paper. So you all saw my paper yesterday, so I'm not going through all the details of it, but let me talk about the equilibrium part of it. So as just reminder, because I know we learned from John that we don't pay attention all the time to everything. In this paper, we're trying to understand the implications of policy uncertainty for coal-fired electricity generators. They're competing in these local markets that are a US state. They earn profits and they make these technology adoption or exit decisions to comply with the regulations. Okay. The issue is that the time to potential MATS enforcement, TAO, like 3 years before the policy is potentially going to be enforced. I have some probability that I believe it will be enforced. And that changes incentives to invest or exit. And so there's like 2 time subscripts running around, right? There's 2012 and there's 4 years to enforcement. But 4 years to enforcement in some other state may not be 2012. And that's part of what makes the whole calculation somewhat complicated. We're modeling these dynamic oligopoly equilibrium outcomes, excuse me, where every generator understands it can potentially affect market states. And we think this is right in coal markets in a US state. There's somewhere between like 5 and 20 generators in each of these states. They're generally, pretty sizable things, and they understand that they're playing against each other. Okay. So the market states that we're going to keep track of is the share of coal that's adopted the abatement technology, the coal capacity in the market relative to load, so what share of the total electricity demand can be met by coal, and the fuel price ratio for exactly those reasons I told before. All right, so how do we do it? Part of the issue here is choosing, I went through oblivious equilibrium and moment-based Markov and said, oh, we just got some fringe distribution. Great, easy. But you got to choose how you're going to characterize that. I was using the running example of capacity bins, but it could be all sorts of things. And so here we're going to think of these market states as evolving, as changing over time according to AR1 regressions. Okay, so for every potential value of theta, we're going to pick some choosing AR1 regression. We're going to choose some AR1 regression that gives us expectations of, for instance, how coal capacity is going to evolve, right? So in general, that one's going down. Share it's going to adopt is going up, right? Stuff like that. Relatively simple. We're going to need this to be separate for each US state, year to potential enforcement, and market state. So let's think about that for a second, right? I'm sitting in 2013 in Illinois, pick a random state, and I need to understand that in 2013, how adoption is going to evolve going forward is going to look very different than in 2015. Because in 2015, enforcement's about to happen, right? Maybe, with some probability. And so I need separate AR1 regressions for each of these things. I can't just say that that's stable, because the policy environment's changing, but then of course also like natural gas prices are changing. And so fundamentally, we're going to run 4 AR1 regressions on the simulated data for each tau in each state. Coal capacity relative to load, that's relatively straightforward. And actually, let me come back to that in a second. So coal capacity relative to load. The second one is the share of coal as adopted technology. In this regression, this is actually 3 regressions. Why is it 3 regressions? I know that if I adopt, this will evolve in a different way than if I don't adopt, right? I mean, I'm 1/10 of the market. And so fundamentally, if my capacity goes into the technology adoption state, this thing's going to go up. I know that. It's going to go up by more than if I don't adopt in expectation. And I need a third one for like, well, I already adopted a while ago, so I don't have a choice here, and I expect it to have a different time path. These regressions are going to have in them fuel price interacted with things like lagged adoption. And that's going to allow my expectations to also be different if natural gas prices are high versus low relative to coal. Okay. Questions? This is the key of this paper. I didn't get into it yesterday. So the key part of this equilibrium, the way we're implementing it, the way we are you to understand that you're affecting the market is literally by running these regressions, these separate regressions. Why? Here's a check on whether you're following. Why do I only have 1 regression for coal capacity relative to load? What do I do that affects coal capacity? What's my choice? I do what? Cement? Cement's always the answer. Exit. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exit. So for adoption, I'm choosing whether to adopt the technology or not. For capacity, I'm choosing whether to exit or not. If I exit, I get a scrap value and I'm done. I don't care what the state looks like after that point. Right? Okay, so that's the check. It's like I care about the adoption decision, how that evolves forward. As long as I'm staying in the market, I care about that, and I'm going to care about it. Well, I'm going to care about it similarly in the future, but it's going to evolve differently depending on what I do today. Okay. All right. So all of these things have a whole bunch of interactions in here, and we're not just doing a straight AR1 with no additional covariates. We're interacting. We have lagged adoption times fuel price on its own, stuff like that. So this is really the meat of the paper, where we're allowing you to influence the state, right? And we're allowing you to know that you can. And then you can just simulate this, right? All I literally need to do is say, okay, conditional on me choosing, so I get some draw where I choose to adopt. Everybody else in the market gets simulated draws. I see what next period's adoption share is going to be. I can have as much data as I want on that because I'm simulating it, right? And I run the regression. Make sense? Okay. So we can do this, we do this over and over again until basically the expectations, those AR1 regression coefficients aren't changing. And then we can calculate the likelihood, and then we can move to a better theta and repeat the whole thing again. So let me be clear, I'm saying we're running 4 AR1 regressions. I actually haven't counted how many AR1 regressions get run in a single equilibrium, but it's like 4 times the number of states times the number of years tau. There's a lot, right? Okay, pros and cons. We think it has some advantages, that's why we used it, that's why we sort of worked so hard on it. We know all players can affect the market state. It allows for preemption. So we worked really hard on this. And actually Nick Buchholz sent us some emails, and he was like, I don't think you're doing it right, and we went back and forth. And then we did the counterfactual with no ability to preempt, and it basically didn't change anything. So, you know, which is actually in some ways reassuring because we're not modeling, you know, multiple unit ownership, multiple generator ownership. And this is sort of telling us a little bit, at least these guys are relatively small in the market. They've realized that me adopting isn't enough to drastically influence your incentives to adopt. That's what preemption would look like here. Or me adopting doesn't sort of encourage you out of the market. But it does allow for this. And I think there's super interesting questions in IO in particular that could be answered by thinking this through, right? By understanding that, you know, I can do something that I know makes you do something else that's good for me in the future, right? It allows for market transitions. So importantly, we have this aggregate state, fuel prices. Fuel prices aren't affected by anything in our model. It evolves completely exogenously, but it really changes behavior, right? It's first order for whether you're earning profits as a coal power plant. And in particular, you sort of saw in the paper yesterday that during the MATS period, there's a ton of exit in response to MATS. Well, at least there was a ton of exit. During the other states period, they were mostly adopting. As we estimate, some of that's coming from differences in adoption costs, but a lot of that's coming from the natural gas prices just being drastically different in those two periods. The flexibility in modeling market states and transitions between states is really nice here. You can think of all sorts of regressions you could run that you could build in. So let me just give you one example that we've actually been thinking a little bit about. We estimate a profit surface in this paper. You know, we estimate profits in the world and we put some surface on it over the states. We could actually have firm fixed effects in that regression. And the interesting thing about that is then some, like the average value of the firm fixed effects of the firms in a market could be an aggregate state that we allow you to have expectations over. You have expectations over all sorts of things that might affect your profits. And that would allow for some serial correlation in the paper. So we're sort of batting that around. This clearly has limitations. Like all of these have limitations. A big limitation here is I don't care about identities of anybody else, right? All I care about is this aggregate market state. So it can't be that Fedor and I really hate each other and really, I really want to stick it to him, right? I just really want his profits to be low. I hate it. He's right next door to me and he's always shipping out all those goods and it's just terrible. That can't matter, right? I can't care about the identities. And in particular, you know, just like in MME, where this choice over who's dominant, who's fringe, you have to use judgment here. You have to choose what are the right aggregate states to follow. What do we think are the most important things that affect flow utilities, that affect profits? Okay. Overall, my sense is that there are a lot of questions that these types of methods could be very useful in answering. Okay. And I think that's, I think the strategic implications of regulatory interventions There's all sorts of regulations that end up having unintended consequences ex post, right? That we see them doing things that we didn't expect them to do. It would be really nice if we could actually expect this ahead of time and tell people not to do these kinds of policies. And a lot of this is going to come from strategic interactions. So we need to be better at modeling this and better at figuring that out. All right. Yeah.
Is there any possibility, or if you explored using outside investors' perceptions of these firms' values as a check on whether you're doing a good job?
Yeah. So we thought a little bit about this. The thing in electricity that's really nice is just the sheer volume of data and how much we observe. So we can do what we think is a pretty good job of getting at annual profits, let's say, contemporaneous profits. That's not true in a lot of other industries, right? But that said, it doesn't mean that it's crazy to try to tie that back to, say, stock prices and things like that. The thing that worries me slightly here is, of course, with stock prices, you'd really like, for good identification, like kind of event study type stuff. But for an event study, the information has to change. And I worry that in our context, these probabilities are what's going to affect the valuations. And I don't know that we have good, like, bunch of information was revealed on this day kinds of things. Because what I care more about than like levels of profits is differences in profits, of course, because it's a discrete choice model, right? So I care about discounted flow of profits, but the difference in that across states. And so then I need differences in stock prices across states. That's all I'm trying to say. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, oh yeah.
This may be a bit of a naive question. What if you just got rid of all the strategic interaction?
Okay.
And model this policy change? Is the issue that you need strategic interaction for the rest cover the fixed cost that you're for entry?
Okay, so there's no entry in this model. Cole's not entering.
Oh, so there's
Basically,
okay.
it's only exit. Yep, exit and adoption.
So then you can't get rid of all the strategic stuff. Everyone's price taking, what you're saying.
I don't want to get, well, okay, so there's a couple, yeah, there's a couple of ideas here. One is that I think that it's fundamentally true that the exit decision, well, first of all, the exit decision affects profits. Clear. My exit decision affects your profits. These are relatively large. You shouldn't think of these as epsilon-sized firms that move something on some sort of frontier. You know, these are big chunks of generation that are going to go offline and change expected electricity prices into the future. Yeah. As I said, there's like, 5 to 20 of these guys in a state, more or less. So from that standpoint, I absolutely, when I'm deciding whether I want to stay in the market or not, I need to consider whether you're staying in. Now, of course, I'm going to get logit draws on top of that stuff. So we don't end up with an equilibrium where like, I want to stay in if you go out and you want to stay in if I go out and I don't know which one happens. But the strategic, it is true. The strategic nature of this, I did just tell you that it didn't actually matter that much in the end. Say la vie. It was an empirical question and the empirics came out a certain way. And that's why we're not presenting a whole bunch of that in the paper. But fundamentally, partially that's why I do think of these methods as being interesting for taking to other situations where the strategic nature is more first order. There is still the potential that, if I do something like adopt the technology, that's a signal to you that you should exit the market. Yeah. But it ended up not being first order here. Okay, other questions? Okay, so in the last 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, 1 minute, it's research questions. I'm just giving out research ideas. What do I see as a few of the big questions in EEE that require dynamics? All right, I think political economy is going to be huge. We say carbon taxes, carbon taxes, carbon taxes, carbon taxes. That's it, except Europe. And so fundamentally, why aren't they adopted? What's getting in the way? Is this, turnover in legislatures? Is this turnover in executives? What's going on? I think a lot of that is about dynamics and about expected future policies and all of that. And so I think that's a dynamic question, although you could imagine static versions. How do policymakers decide when to pass legislation versus to continue to argue for better legislative terms? That's a clear dynamic question. Green innovation. How do you get more or less innovation in clean technologies? What affects the decisions to offer those products, for consumers to buy those products? Is there a role for policy in that? I mean, clearly, I think the answer is potentially yes, but what's the efficient role of policies is still a question. And what affects external financing of long-run environmental and R&D investments? Is there enough money flowing into these things to answer the questions in time to not cook? I mean, that's what it boils down to. Market design, I'm definitely thinking a bunch about market design now going forward. Can policy change risk or uncertainty in ways that are low cost to government but high value to firms? Power purchase agreements and electricity for solar or wind are prime examples of this. I guarantee you a price of electricity going forward. Are there ways to move us to better equilibria? And do we trust our models enough to think that we might try to do that? The answer to A may be yes. The answer to B, no. To B, do we trust our models enough, is almost definitely no right now. And then finally, interdependencies. I brought this up already briefly. As I said, I don't believe most of the literature on peer effects in electricity and solar and all of that. I just don't believe it. Good identification is like first order important there. Correlated unobservables are just super problematic in that literature. And so disentangling what's a correlated unobservable shock, either correlated over time or across firms in the same period, which is also problematic for peer effects. It's hard, but the return to really good work there is super, super high. Okay, there we go. Happy to talk about any more of these later.